In April 1944, a 23-year-old Army Signal Corps technician armed with nothing but stolen fence wire, a car battery, and high school physics knowledge managed to shut down German military communications across a 40-mile radius in northern France, and the Pentagon didn't find out about it until 3 weeks later. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, at what time it is there right now. Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the front lines. His orders placed him 15 miles behind the forward positions, tucked safely in a communications trailer where his job consisted of maintaining radio equipment, filing signal reports, and occasionally fixing a broken field telephone. The Army had identified Kowalski as someone with technical aptitude after he mentioned during basic training that he'd built crystal radio sets as a teenager in rural Wisconsin. That small admission earned him a ticket to Signal Corps School at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, where he spent 6 months learning the fundamentals of military communications, frequency allocation, antenna theory, field telephone maintenance, and the absolute sacrosanct importance of maintaining radio discipline. But what the Army didn't know, and what would never appear in Kowalski's service record, was that before the war, Raymond Kowalski hadn't just built crystal radios. He'd been running an unlicensed amateur radio station from his family's dairy farm, broadcasting under the call sign The Midnight Farmer to other radio enthusiasts across the Midwest. The Federal Communications Commission had shut him down twice. His neighbors had complained about the interference with their programs 3 times, and his father had threatened to dismantle the whole operation 4 times after Kowalski's late-night transmissions disrupted the family's own radio reception during broadcast of the World Series. The point is, Kowalski knew radio. Not just the theoretical knowledge they taught at Fort Monmouth, but the practical, hands-on understanding of how electromagnetic waves behaved in the real world, how they interfered with each other, and most importantly, how to make one radio signal completely overpower another. The military had a polite term for this: electronic countermeasures. Kowalski's FCC violation notices had used a different term: malicious interference. By April 1944, the Allied invasion of France was approaching. Everyone knew it was coming. The only questions were when and where. The 28th Infantry Division, to which Kowalski was attached, had been repositioned to southern England as part of the massive buildup. Training intensified, equipment inspections became daily events, and the Signal Corps, Kowalski's unit, received a steady stream of classified briefings about German communication capabilities in occupied France. This is where Kowalski learned something that bothered him, something that kept him awake in his tent long after lights out. The briefings detailed German radio networks with impressive clarity. Wehrmacht units in France operated on predictable frequencies. Their communication protocols followed rigid schedules. Their radio operators transmitted in clear German, often without proper encryption, because they assumed Allied forces lacked the linguistic capability to translate fast enough for tactical intelligence to matter. But here's what really caught Kowalski's attention. The Germans were using a centralized communication network in Normandy. Instead of each unit operating independently, battalion and regimental headquarters routed their traffic through regional communication centers. From a military efficiency standpoint, this made sense. It reduced the number of radio operators needed, standardized procedures, and allowed senior officers to monitor unit communications. From an electronic warfare standpoint, it was a single point of failure waiting to be exploited. The technical specifications were right there in the briefing documents. German military radios in France primarily operated in the high-frequency band between 3 and 6 MHz. Their most common sets, the Torn FU-D2 and the larger Torn FU-F, transmitted with power outputs between 10 and 80 watts, depending on the configuration. The briefings noted these frequencies, documented their transmission patterns, and filed this information away as useful intelligence for monitoring purposes.
Kowalski saw something different. He saw an entire communication network that could theoretically be disrupted by a sufficiently powerful radio transmitter operating on the same frequencies. The briefings never suggested doing this. Allied doctrine focused on monitoring enemy communications, not interfering with them. There were good reasons for this. If you jammed enemy radio, they knew you were there and would change frequencies. If you just listened, they kept talking and you kept learning. Standard military logic. But Kowalski started thinking about a different scenario. What if you weren't behind enemy lines, trying to stay hidden? What if you were about to launch the largest amphibious invasion in human history and you wanted German defenders confused, disorganized, and unable to coordinate their response during those critical first hours? Suddenly, the strategic calculus shifted. Who cares if they know you're jamming them if they can't do anything about it? The invasion happened on June 6, 1944. Kowalski's unit landed on Utah Beach on June 8, part of the second wave bringing communication equipment and personnel to establish proper radio networks behind the beachhead. The landing itself was relatively uneventful for Kowalski. No German artillery found his landing craft. No machine gun fire raked the beach as his boots hit French sand. By the time his unit came ashore, the beach was secure and the immediate focus had shifted inland. Within 48 hours, Kowalski was back to his assigned role, sitting in a communication trailer, maintaining equipment, filing reports. The front line had pushed about 8 miles inland. German resistance was stiffening, and Allied intelligence reported the German reinforcements were beginning to arrive from deeper in France. Units that had been held in reserve were now moving toward the invasion area, and they were coordinating their movements through radio communication. This is when Kowalski started paying attention to the German radio traffic. His job didn't officially include monitoring enemy communications. The Army had dedicated intelligence units for that. But Kowalski had access to radio equipment, knew the frequencies from the pre-invasion briefings, and possessed enough curiosity to tune in during his off hours. What he heard frustrated him. German radio operators were coordinating troop movements, artillery positions, and supply routes in clear voice transmission. Sometimes they used basic code words, but often they just spoke plainly in German, apparently confident that even if Americans intercepted the transmissions, the information would take too long to translate and disseminate to be tactically useful. And they were partially right. By the time intelligence units translated a German radio message, typed up a report, and pushed it through command channels, the tactical situation had often changed. But Kowalski wasn't interested in translation. He was interested in disruption. On June 15th, 7 days after landing in France, Kowalski approached his commanding officer, Captain William Morris, with what he carefully framed as a technical suggestion. German radio traffic in their sector was heavy and predictable. They transmitted on known frequencies at scheduled times. Would it be possible, Kowalski asked, to create some kind of interference that might disrupt their communications during critical operations?
Captain Morris considered the suggestion for approximately 15 seconds before rejecting it. The Army had procedures for electronic warfare, and those procedures didn't involve enlisted technicians conducting unauthorized radio experiments. If higher command wanted German communications jammed, they would assign that mission to appropriate units with proper equipment. Kowalski's job was to maintain American radio equipment, not to play around with enemy frequencies. Discussion closed. Kowalski said, "Yes, sir," saluted, and returned to his duties. But the idea didn't leave him. Over the next week, as he performed routine maintenance and listened to German radio chatter during quiet moments, Kowalski started working through the practical challenges. Could he actually build an effective jammer with available materials? The theoretical answer was yes. Any radio transmitter becomes a jammer if it broadcasts noise on frequencies other people are trying to use. The practical challenges were power and antenna design. Military radio jammers were sophisticated devices. They used high-powered transmitters, carefully tuned antennas, and frequency-agile designs that could hop across multiple channels. Kowalski had none of these things. What he did have was access to spare radio parts, basic electronics knowledge, and a growing conviction that even crude interference might prove valuable during the right tactical situation. The technical problem broke down into 3 components. First,
He needed a power source capable of generating enough electrical energy to drive a transmitter with meaningful output. Second, he needed a transmitter circuit that could convert that electrical energy into radio frequency signals. Third, he needed an antenna that could efficiently radiate those signals into space on the frequencies Germans were using. For the power source, Kowalski had access to military vehicle batteries. The standard U.S. Army 6-volt battery, used in Jeeps and trucks, could provide substantial current if properly configured. Wire 4 of them in series and you had 24 volts. Not ideal for radio transmission, but workable. The real challenge was the transmitter circuit. Military radios used sophisticated oscillator designs with crystal-controlled frequency stability. Kowalski didn't have crystals for German frequencies, and even if he did, building a proper transmitter would require components he couldn't easily acquire or explain. But here's the thing about radio jamming. You don't need a clean signal. In fact, a dirty signal, one that splattered energy across a wide frequency range, was exactly what you wanted for disruption. Kowalski needed to build what radio engineers called a spark gap transmitter. Essentially, a controlled electrical arc that would spray electromagnetic noise across the spectrum. This is where the farm wire came in. In late June, Kowalski's unit moved to a new position near the village of Carentan. The area was agricultural land, small farms carved out of the Norman countryside, now mostly abandoned as the war rolled through. Kowalski noticed something during a routine patrol. The farms used simple wire fencing to contain livestock, not barbed wire. Just plain steel wires strung between wooden posts, miles of it crisscrossing the fields. That wire, Kowalski realized, was exactly what he needed. Radio antennas don't have to be sophisticated. They just need to be conductive and sized appropriately for the frequency you want to transmit. For the high-frequency band where German military radios operated, an antenna somewhere between 40 and 80 feet long would be reasonably efficient. The farm fencing wire was already there, already the right length, and completely unguarded. On the night of June 28th, Kowalski requisitioned a Jeep for what he logged as equipment transport duties. He drove to an abandoned farm about 2 miles from his unit's position, parked in the shadow of a collapsed barn, and spent the next 3 hours cutting down fence wire. He took approximately 200 feet of wire, carefully coiling it in the back of the Jeep, and returned to base before dawn. Nobody questioned the Jeep trip. Nobody asked about the wire. In the chaos of establishing supply lines and forward positions, one sergeant driving around at night barely registered as unusual. Building the jammer took another week. Kowalski worked on it during off-duty hours, assembling components in a corner of the communication trailer when other technicians were occupied elsewhere. The design was crude but functional. He created a spark gap oscillator using a truck ignition coil, a mechanical contact breaker salvaged from a damaged generator, and a bank of capacitors pulled from spare radio equipment. The circuit was simple. Charge the capacitors from the battery bank, discharge them across a spark gap, and let the resulting electromagnetic pulse couple into the antenna.
The antenna itself was more complicated. Kowalski strung the farm wire between 2 trees behind the communication trailer, trying to make it look like a standard military long-wire antenna that might plausibly be used for regular communications. He didn't want anyone asking questions about unusual antenna configurations. The wire was far from ideal. It sagged in places, had multiple splices where he'd connected different sections, and lacked any proper impedance matching to the transmitter. But radio waves don't care about perfection. They'll radiate from any piece of metal if you pump enough energy into it. On July 8th, Kowalski's jammer was ready. He tested it briefly during a thunderstorm when the natural static might mask any unusual radio interference, and confirmed that it did indeed generate powerful electromagnetic noise. The spark gap crackled and spit. The antenna wire vibrated slightly from the electrical stress, and Kowalski's own radio receiver, tuned to German frequencies, went completely silent, overwhelmed by the wall of noise his device was generating. Now he just needed a reason to use it. That reason arrived on July 12th in the form of intelligence reports about a German counterattack being prepared in the sector. Wehrmacht units were massing for a coordinated push intended to slow the Allied advance. Radio traffic intercepted by intelligence units indicated the attack would launch sometime in the next 48 hours, and German commanders were using radio heavily to coordinate the movement of artillery, armor, and infantry.
Kowalski approached Captain Morris again, this time with more specific information. German radio traffic was heavy on known frequencies. A coordinated attack required communication. What if that communication could be disrupted? Morris was skeptical, but the tactical situation made him more willing to listen. The German counterattack could hit their sector hard. Anything that might degrade enemy coordination was worth considering. "What are you proposing, Sergeant?" Morris asked. Kowalski explained the concept in broad terms, carefully omitting the fact that he'd already built the device. He suggested that with proper equipment, it might be possible to create radio interference that would disrupt German communications during the critical phase of their attack. Morris listened, thought it over, and told Kowalski he'd check with higher command about the possibility of getting proper jamming equipment. Kowalski nodded, saluted, and didn't wait for higher command. That night, at 22:30 hours, he activated his farm wire jammer. The spark gap roared to life, drawing heavy current from the battery bank. The antenna wire hummed with electromagnetic energy, and across a 40-mile radius, every German military radio operating in the high-frequency band suddenly went dead, buried under a blanket of crackling static that made communication impossible. German radio operators immediately tried to adapt. They switched frequencies, moving from their primary channels to backup frequencies. Kowalski's jammer hit those too. The spark gap transmitter wasn't frequency-specific. It generated noise across the entire HF spectrum, a broadband interference that couldn't be evaded by simply changing channels. German operators tried increasing their transmitter power, assuming they were dealing with natural atmospheric interference. It didn't help. Kowalski's jammer, sitting just a few miles from many of the German positions, was close enough that inverse square law worked in his favor. Radio signals weaken with distance, but his interference signal had much less distance to travel than German signals trying to reach their command posts. The German counterattack launched the next morning at 0600 hours. Without reliable radio communication, German units fell back on older methods. Motorcycle couriers, telephone landlines were available, and direct visual signals. These methods worked, but they were slower, much slower. Decisions that should have taken minutes required hours. Artillery support that should have been coordinated through radio command now required physical runners moving between units. The attack proceeded, but without the synchronized precision the German commanders had planned.
Kowalski kept the jammer running for 16 hours straight, cycling through different battery banks as they depleted. The spark gap overheated twice, forcing brief shutdowns for cooling. The antenna wire connection failed once, requiring quick field repairs. But the device kept working, kept pumping electromagnetic interference into the air, kept German radios silent. On July 14th, Captain Morris received an unusual inquiry from Division Intelligence. Were there any unusual radio equipment operations in their sector? Several German prisoners had mentioned radio problems during the recent battle. Morris said he'd check into it, then went looking for Kowalski. He found his communications sergeant behind the trailer, dismantling what looked like a homemade electronics project connected to a suspiciously non-regulation antenna wire. "Sergeant," Morris said slowly, "tell me that's not what I think it is." Kowalski looked up from coiling the farm wire and said, "Depends on what you think it is, sir." The conversation that followed was tense. Kowalski had operated unauthorized radio equipment. He'd conducted electronic warfare without orders. He'd stolen farm wire from French property. He'd diverted military batteries to an unauthorized purpose. Any one of these violations could result in court-martial. But Morris was also aware of the tactical reality. The German counterattack had failed. American casualties were lower than projected, and intelligence reports indicated that German radio problems had contributed to their disorganized assault. Whatever Kowalski had done, it had worked. Morris made a command decision. He ordered Kowalski to dismantle the jammer, return all military components to proper inventory, and never speak about this incident again. No report would be filed. No official record would be created. As far as the Army was concerned, this never happened. Kowalski followed orders. The jammer was dismantled. The batteries went back to the motor pool.
The radio components returned to supply. The farm wire disappeared back into the Norman countryside. And for 3 weeks, nobody outside Kowalski's immediate unit knew anything about what had happened. Then, Division Intelligence conducted a thorough debrief of the July 13th battle, correlating prisoner interviews with tactical outcomes. German prisoners consistently mentioned radio failures. Some described it as equipment malfunction. Others suspected American jamming, but couldn't explain how, since U.S. forces weren't known to have tactical radio jamming capability at the battalion level. The intelligence reports reached a radio intelligence analyst at 1st Army headquarters who'd worked in radio before the war. He read the descriptions of the interference pattern, the wide frequency coverage, and the localized nature of the effect. His report included a single sentence that caused significant interest. Interference characteristics consistent with broadband spark gap transmission from proximity source. Someone at headquarters put together the timeline. The interference started July 12th, the German attack failed July 13th, the interference stopped July 14th, and all of it happened in the sector where the 28th Infantry Division's communication unit was operating. Higher command sent a team to investigate. They arrived in early August, interviewed personnel, and eventually found their way to Sergeant Raymond Kowalski, who by that point had resigned himself to whatever punishment was coming. The investigation concluded that Kowalski indeed had built and operated an unauthorized radio jammer using improvised components. The technical assessment noted that the device, while crude, had been surprisingly effective. The tactical assessment concluded that the jamming operation had provided material advantage during a critical battle. The legal assessment identified multiple regulation violations. The final recommendation was contradictory: reprimand Kowalski for unauthorized actions, while also noting that those actions had achieved valuable tactical results.
The Pentagon's decision came down in September. Kowalski would receive no punishment. He would also receive no commendation. The entire incident would be classified, and the details would not be included in official histories. The reasoning was simple. The Army didn't want to encourage improvised electronic warfare operations by enlisted technicians, but they also didn't want to punish initiative that had proven tactically valuable. The solution was to make the whole thing disappear into classified files. Kowalski finished the war maintaining radio equipment, exactly as his orders specified. He never built another jammer. He never spoke publicly about the incident. After the war, he returned to Wisconsin, took a job as a radio technician for a local broadcasting station, and lived quietly until his death in 1987. The classified files about his farm wire jammer remained sealed until 1994, when routine declassification released them to the National Archives. By that point, most of the participants were dead, the technical details were obsolete, and the story had become a historical footnote. But here's what makes this story worth remembering. The Army had proper doctrine for electronic warfare. They had trained specialists, sophisticated equipment, and established procedures. None of that was deployed at the tactical level in July 1944 because the doctrine didn't call for it. Kowalski ignored doctrine, violated regulations, and built something the Army said he couldn't build using materials the Army said were inappropriate. And it worked, because sometimes the gap between what doctrine says should happen and what actually needs to happen requires someone willing to improvise with fence wire and truck batteries. The military studied the incident after the war, not to punish anyone but to learn. The farm wire jammer incident became a classified case study in signals intelligence schools, an example of how electronic warfare could be conducted with minimal resources if you understood the underlying principles. Modern military jamming equipment is sophisticated, powerful, and nothing like Kowalski's crude device, but the fundamental insight remains. Radio communication is vulnerable to interference, and that vulnerability can be exploited with surprisingly simple methods if you know what you're doing. Kowalski's jammer worked for one specific reason: proximity. Military radio signals follow the inverse square law. Power decreases with the square of the distance. Kowalski's jammer was physically close to German radio positions, much closer than their command posts. His weak signal overpowered their stronger signals simply by being nearby. It's the same principle that makes your neighbor's wireless router interfere with yours even though commercial radio stations broadcasting at 50,000 watts don't. Distance matters more than power in radio warfare. The farm wire itself was almost irrelevant. Kowalski could have used any conductive material. The German prisoners who mentioned the interference never realized they'd been jammed by stolen fence wire. They assumed they were up against sophisticated American electronic warfare equipment. The reality? A Wisconsin farm boy with high school physics knowledge and borrowed batteries never occurred to them. Sometimes the most effective weapons are the ones nobody expects because they're too simple to be taken seriously. The farm wire jammer wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't elegant. It violated about a dozen regulations, but for 16 hours in July 1944, it shut down German military radio across 40 miles of occupied France, and the men who built it using nothing but fence wire and determination never made it into the history books until 50 years after the war ended.